Our topic today is COP27 conclusions. It's a great pleasure having Tammy Nimet. Dr. Nimet is a UK-based strategic energy analyst. Good afternoon, Tammy Nimet.
Hello, how are you today?
Good, thank you so much. You are 3 hours different, I suppose. You are in London today? Are you in London?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Oh, please let me start with I listened to your recent podcast with Ron Wallace, and I saw your recent articles related to energy. Very
Thank
good,
you.
really good. Let me start asking you, please. Is there more than a creation of the Financial Assistance Fund for the impacts of climate change at COP27, or that's all?
So this is part of the problem with COP27 or any of these COPs is that the journalists pick out one issue and they decide to say whether or not the conference has been successful based on that particular issue. When the reality is that there was all kinds of other things that were presented and agreed upon at COP that don't get the same level of coverage. So, on the one hand, there was the big issue about setting up this fund, the Climate Reparations Fund, or however you wish to word that or define it. And then they were saying it was the conference was a failure because they didn't agree to ban fossil fuels. And various other things. But if you read that document and you paid attention to what else happened at the conference, then you could say, well, actually, there was a fair amount of agreement on how to make it more interventionist and get countries to commit to doing things they may otherwise not have done, or at least to, keep up their confidence in doing these kinds of things. And one of the reports that was launched at COP27, which is one of the articles you're referring to that I wrote with Ron Wallace, was about this UN high-level expert group chaired by Catherine McKenna, who's the former Canadian Environment Minister. And they provided 5 principles and 10 recommendations on how to redefine net zero. And this kind of flew under the radar for people. There was a big sort of coverage for about 3 or 4 days in the media, the Reuters and various other things, but they just went with the press release that they're trying to address greenwashing. But the reality was this report is far different than just challenging greenwashing. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I wasn't
Yeah,
mute.
okay.
There is a statement saying that there is no room for new investment in fossil fuel supply. But in my vision, is there enough renewable energy to replace fossil energy and products made with fossil energies?
That's a really good question because if you look at what's happening in Switzerland, for example, they're saying they don't have enough energy. And so if you have an electric vehicle, they prefer you not to charge it. So even with the renewables the way they are, even if they decided to spend all the money they have on building up the renewables, it still wouldn't be enough because it's intermittent, it's weather dependent. There's no batteries established, like battery farms or whatever. And then it comes to one of the fundamental contradictions of the environmental movement, where they say they want to preserve the land. They want to sort of slow down the industrial buildup, using up different aspects of the land. But if you look at what the land use is for renewables, how much land gets taken up by solar panels? How much gets taken up by windmills? What's the environmental damage to birds and animals and whatnot from this buildup? Then how much land are these battery farms supposed to take up? So if they're using up all this land, and if you compare it to what the land use is of, say, a coal plant or a natural gas fired power plant, it's like magnitudes different. So, first of all, it doesn't provide enough energy for a modern technological society. And
Mhm.
second of all, it uses up so much land and causes significant environmental damage that just kind of gets swept under the carpet.
Yeah. You mentioned that renewables are intermittent and maybe insufficient yet. And so we cannot stop new oil and gas projects. Is it correct?
I believe so. I mean, if we want to keep the standard of living in a modern technological society, you need reliable energy and you need quite a lot of it. I mean, governments keep talking about how they want everything to be digital. Well, where do they think the energy is coming from to maintain that digital infrastructure? If they want all these databases, they need the internet to do things and so on. That all takes a lot of energy. And even Google, that tried to go 100% renewable, didn't work, and they knew it didn't work. So, they can invest all this money into these things and it still won't be sufficient. So I think in your conversation with David Blackman, he was talking about the statement made by the president of Uganda, and I think that he was absolutely right. Just like the president of Saudi Aramco was absolutely right in saying that we need this investment and we need to keep producing fossil fuels because right now they're really the only thing that works. And even if you went for nuclear full on, that takes quite a long time to build. So until that nuclear is in place, you're not gonna. We can't do this transition the way they're talking about. It's just people will suffer, and we're seeing in Europe that people are suffering.
And in reality, we are not playing this game with security, with energy security. We are kidding with energy security, no?
Right. I mean, energy security doesn't even factor into it. I mean, that's what's so profoundly frightening is that energy security is they try to say that if we just invest more in renewables, security will be taken care of. And that isn't that actually makes you more vulnerable. It makes you vulnerable to weather. It makes you vulnerable to this intermittency because we don't have backup. So how exactly does that help keep you secure? So yeah, from a security perspective, it's just absurd.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. We have something from Claudio Araújo. Brazilians are watching you every time that we make this events. Regarding COP27, do you guys think carbon capture will take the lead in energy transition next years?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things that happened at COP27 this year was that there's a group of oil sands producers out of Canada called the Pathways Alliance. And they are working so diligently and spending so much money trying to invest in carbon capture so that whatever emissions are generated from the production of the oil sands, and there's a fair amount of energy involved in that, that they can capture it. And they're creating these various carbon dioxide pipelines to move it around, put it back into reservoirs and so on. One of the oldest carbon capture projects in the world is in Saskatchewan, Canada, where I think for almost 20 years now, they've been researching this, seeing what happens when you put it far deep enough. Does it migrate at all? And the research has been resounding in that it's successful.
Mm-hmm.
But the environmentalists and the people who are pushing the energy transition don't want it. So on the one hand, you'll see, I think, investment going in as long as companies get credit for it. But the way that the Canadian government has done their incentives for carbon capture is that if you're using it for enhanced oil recovery, or if in any way it helps produce more oil and gas, it doesn't count. So, I mean, on the one hand, they're saying, yes, please invest in this. But on the other hand, they're not allowing companies to get credit for it. So the only way they get credit for it is if it goes underground, but doesn't actually help produce any more oil and gas.
Perfect.
So, why would companies invest in something that they can't use properly? There's a fair amount of technology there, and the technology is getting better, but it does require a lot of investment. And with
And
the
time.
new and time, right? And the new financial standards that they want to implement within the next year or two, companies have to report their gross emissions, and they don't get to take into account how they've offset it or used carbon capture to bring it down to net emissions. They only want your absolute emissions. So why then would a company invest in carbon capture if they're not allowed to take credit for it?
Yeah, perfect. Oh, there is a person that I like too much. Is my professor, my teacher, David Blackman, who is what he's asking. Dr. Nimitz is said right. Yeah, that's said. He said policymakers are even thinking about energy security until a crisis strikes. Energy security is national security. Perfect, David Blackman. The two are yeah, perfect.
Inextricably
What's
linked.
about?
You're absolutely right, David. I mean, China gets this, right? I mean, China is building how many coal-fired plants to make sure that their national security is taken care of through their energy security. And that used to be the case. I mean, if you look at the policymakers from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it was all you needed to have energy security to have national security. And during the Cold War, that was very evident, very evident. But it was like after the Cold War, the Western governments decided, well, hey, everything's peaceful. We don't need to worry about national security so much anymore in that respect. So we can pursue this line regardless of what happens. And now we're seeing what does happen when you push forward with this. I mean, Europe is an energy basket case. So how can they possibly have any type of national security when they have gutted militaries and they don't have energy in which to keep themselves powered?
Perfect. David loved the point about China.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
they get it, right? And it's interesting because they're involved in a lot of these initiatives to push the West, to encourage the West to go down this transition pathway, because they get two things out of it. Number one, most of the windmills and solar panels are built out of China, so they get a lot of
80,
economic
80% or
wealth,
more.
right? And the second thing is they make their competitors weak. So the West becomes weaker, America becomes weaker, Europe becomes weaker, and it puts China in a much stronger position strategically and
Perfect.
economically.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And Dr. Nimet, there is another statement that says publishing 5-year plans for reducing absolute emissions along the entire value chain. My
Yeah.
point for you is maybe some small companies around the world don't know the meaning of the word emissions. What do you think about that?
That's a good point because ultimately a lot of this comes down to how you define things. And I find that a lot of these terms are very vaguely defined, if they're defined at all, which leaves it open to interpretation to whoever's listening. So it's like with the concept of net zero. If you ask anybody, well, what do you think net zero means? And if they bother to think about it, it would be, well, it's like my finances. I have my gross salary, then the tax man comes and takes stuff off, and then I have what my net salary is. And the same thing with emissions. If you have gross emissions, then if you're using carbon capture, buying offsets, or any of these other things, then you should be able to deduct that, and then you see what your net emissions are. But the way that they're doing this now, they're sort of pushing that definition aside and saying, you know what? We think for net zero, all that matters is your absolute emissions. So it doesn't matter if you're investing in carbon capture, if you're buying offsets, if you're doing any of this stuff, it doesn't matter. It's only what your absolute emissions are. And then companies will have to figure out, okay, so what do they mean by emissions? Is it just what I'm emitting to produce my product? Or then it becomes, well, that's scope one. Scope two is it's whatever emissions come out of the power from the power plant that you're purchasing. So you have to account for that. And then your scope three is everything else. So if your product, how much does it cost to transport it in emissions from your place to wherever it's going? Then the emissions embedded in its processing, you have to account for. The emissions embedded in someone using your product, you have to account for that. The emissions embedded in the disposal of that product, the end
A
you're
wide
supposed to
concept.
account for that too. Everything. So if you look at the greenhouse gas protocol, they list all of these things. And in my report, Counting Carbon Molecules, that's on my website, thenemothreport.com, I have a screen capture of what that scope 3 emissions means. And it's insane. It's insane. If you produce anything, like that's tangible, you have to make all this accounting. But if you do something where you're not really producing anything, maybe a financial service, not so much, unless, of course, you're financing fossil fuel projects or industrial production. Then you have to, what's the embedded emissions in that?
Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure that I heard it well, but Ron Wallace, in your podcast with him, said in that fast track to net zero is nuclear war. I'm, am I wrong?
Yeah, he said that in the sense of, if you become super dependent on renewables, and it makes things, it allows hostile players to take actions they probably wouldn't normally do. And I think he was speaking in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. And so if people are escalating the response, it could very well end up in nuclear war. So you could make the argument that the energy transition, which made Europe dependent, which took away their ability to have true energy and national security, it can allow hostile actors to take actions they normally wouldn't. And in this case, and because they've been talking about this, the potential for strategic nuclear strikes and so on, and that's from both sides. Russia's kind of mentioned it. The Americans have kind of mentioned it. So that's what he was talking about in that context.
At the end of this podcast with Ron was fantastic for my vision. You mentioned incompetence or malice. You remember that?
Yeah.
And Ron answer you that probably is more unprepared managers than malice. But my question for you is: could there be a hidden agenda behind these energy confusions? Something, let's see, um, is a is not random. It's something that was planned. Do you think that?
That's a complicated question to some extent, because I think there's a bit of both. It's a mix, right? Because after the fall of the Soviet Union, the people in the West who had been promoting socialism and communism, they saw their sort of example fall apart and crumble, and they needed some kind of new cause to bring about the sort of revolution that they wanted. And there's a lot of people who talk about this as a great transformation. Mark Carney, for example, who's the person in charge of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF, the head of the World Bank, Guterres of the UN, they're all talking about how we need a new system. We need a great transformation. And they've been talking about this for many years. And what does that mean, right? There's never, they talk about they need it. They don't say what it is, but they do agree that what we currently have needs to go away. It needs to turn into something else. And so there's been this movement towards altering our energy system, because there was a really good article back, I think it was in 2014, about synchronous failure. And this group of scholars led by Thomas Homer Dixon published an article examining that if you have the global interdependencies the way they are, there's certain things that you can do to create a cascade effect, which will collapse the system. And in their research, they decided, or they came upon the conclusion, that the one keystone that's holding the entire system together is oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
It's fossil fuel dependent, reliable, affordable energy. And if you can take out that keystone, all of the rest will break apart.
Yeah.
So Thomas Homer Dixon set up an institute called the Cascade Institute in Victoria, in British Columbia. And that is their goal, to collapse the system. So they've been producing a lot of different studies and reports and influencing certain policymakers to do that. Well, how do you do that? Well, you destabilize the system by
That's the motivation.
Exactly. So you promote all that, and you star financing for things that are reliable, like fossil fuels. And if you look at the data charts, I think David Blackman might have had some of the the investment trends over the past 10 years for oil and gas. I mean, it's like this, right?
Yeah.
So by starving it of capital, you don't replenish the reserves and the what you've been using, and then eventually it will just stop. It'll just stop going. And what Catherine McKenna promoted in her report is that no more new investment. That's it. It's done. Whatever we have, that's it. Now, of course, that applies to publicly listed companies, private companies. It doesn't necessarily apply to state-owned companies.
Yeah.
So if you have PVSD in Venezuela and you have Petrobras out of Brazil, or you have the Chinese National Oil Company, and so that's okay. But if it's a private company like Exxon or whatever, well, then that's different.
Yeah, totally. There's a comment from someone, I don't know the names, a LinkedIn user, but he is saying that also nuclear. Yeah, it's perfect. Listen, the podcast with Dr. Nimitz and Ron Wallace. In the end of this podcast, there is this statement from Ron. Yeah. David Beckman. Is it even possible for a company like ExxonMobil to accurately account for Scope 3 emissions? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is the problem, right? Where how do you account for it? And right now, companies are allowed to estimate, but the devil in the details here is, well, what metric are you using to estimate? What calculations are you making? Is there a standardization of how you estimate what the Scope 3 emissions are? There's a trend in Europe to have every product with a label with their emissions on it, so that every company will have to put forward in a public manner what the embedded emissions are. The hope is that this will then be used to create some kind of data architecture, some kind of database where all of these things will have their emissions established for them, and then you would take into account all of those emissions and so on. But you can see where this is trending, right? Because it'll be, well, that's not fair. We need to have a more precise accounting. It's just an estimate. Maybe those estimates are being manipulated in some way. So we need to have more precise individual accounting. So, for example, I think I mentioned this before, Vancity, which is a community bank in Vancouver, has issued a Carbon Tracker Visa card. So it will show you on your balance exactly how many emissions are embedded in every purchase you make. And you can even set yourself an emissions limit. So instead of controlling how much you spend based on money, it'll be based on how many emissions you have. Alibaba out of China, they're looking to create an app that will show every user who uses any of their things exactly how many emissions are in every purchase, if you're ride sharing.
But considering the complete supply chain from the beginning, minerals and things to make the product?
I don't know. It's a work in progress. I'm not sure. The guy was just kind of saying, wow, this is something we're working on and we think it's going to be really great and helpful for people. But of course, he wasn't open on the details, right? Like, well, what exactly does that include? Is that Scope 3? Is that just Scope 1?
It's a very good point to explore and to understand how they are they measuring this carbon.
Right. So one energy company in Canada fills out the Carbon Disclosure Project's volunteer questionnaire, and it's 161 pages. Who has time to do that? So they have a whole team that does this, and they put in there that for just trying to track the amount of emissions they have a team based on the employee hours. They had to have special software to do it, and various other things. It cost them $750,000 just to track their emissions. I don't know if that includes Scope 3. I think it does for the estimates. So if with this new global financial climate accounting standard, which they want to eventually roll into all companies, who can afford the time to do it, to just manage what your emissions are, let alone all of the other information that they're requiring. So It's extremely costly, and it's not clear how you calculate these things.
Yeah.
You have to do estimates. What are those based on? And then we have to look at what that trajectory, where it's taking us. I don't think it's appropriate to be monitoring individual behavior in
Sure,
such a way
sure.
that's,
It's
and
invasive.
yeah, it's abhorrent for a free society.
Yeah, that's right. So, summarizing, we could say that COP27 brought more than the fund created. There are more things, important things there. Um, Oil and gas is a non-replaceable yet energy and source of products. And we need to take care about energy security that's not so strong at this time in our life.
Absolutely. And I think one of the hardest things, like they're really pushing forward with environmental, social governance metrics and so on. And where's security in that? You would think that if you're looking in terms of social and governance, that to have a nation that has secure energy, that's reliable and affordable, that allows for the economic prosperity and growth of its citizens, you would think that would be a priority. And it's a shame that that policymakers have forgotten that. I guess it only becomes important when there's a war. And even then, like Europe is doubling down, saying that, oh, well, this just proves that we need even more renewables to make things, more unreliable. It's madness. Although Ursula von der Leyen in her speech said that people just have to get used to not using as much energy, and that not
Okay.
using energy is the best form of energy security. I can't believe she
Reduced
said
life.
that.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Let me say thank you for our audience. Next Sunday, sorry, Monday. Every Monday we have with David Blackman in Inislav, our conversation with energy transition topic is a very interesting. And thank you so much, Dr. Tammy Nimitz. It was a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the questions, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you. And I love your energy transition videos. They're so good. I love it.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
You as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye bye.